Can I ask you to take your seats, please, in the process? We like to talk about our successes around here, but I want to do a little true confession and talk about a failure. When I became the interim dean in 2005, there was a young assistant professor that we were trying to get back from Washington. And we did get him back, and then we lost him to a project for the Attorney General. And then he came back, hugely popular in his classes. And the White House Personnel Office was calling about every other day, dangling yet another offer. So a little hard to get him settled into a routine of being an assistant professor working toward tenure. And sure enough, the call came. He ends up as an assistant secretary of Health and Human Services. Administrations change, and he comes back to Austin. And we began to talk about, well, how long before he goes the next step for going up to associate? And the next thing I knew, we lost him again to be the president of a small college in Nebraska, his home state. That failure turned out to have advantages for the country at large, because we now have Senator Ben Sasse. He's a brilliant individual in somewhat small supply in the U.S. Congress in the process, at least in the Senate. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Senator Ben Sasse.
Thank you, Admiral. It does feel like old home week for me to get to be back here. I'm not a particularly sentimental guy, but every time I come back to Austin, I feel a little bit emotional. Getting to be on the faculty at the LBJ school, on paper, I guess I was there for 5 years. In reality, it was 11 months once and 15 months once, and usually I was on 50% leave. But I've done my time grading papers in the LBJ building. So, and Will is an old friend. We got to know each other. We're both the same age, went to school on different coasts, but ended up doing junior year abroad programs at Oxford the same time in 1992. We moved back to the US, and we end up separately going to the Yale History Department, and lived 3 doors away from each other. Lives are quite different, though, when you're a grad student still living like an undergrad. That would be in Bowdoin, and me already married. And back then, before voicemail, when your answering machine, if you screened your calls, it would just play real loudly in your house. And I remember, I think I'm going to try to get in Bowdoin in trouble here. I remember my wife and I moving into our place in the grad ghetto in New Haven, 3 doors away from Will, and literally the first night we're there. You know, we go to bed at like 9 o'clock. We're old people. We're married now. And at like 12:30, the phone rings. I'm like, what kind of nut is, accidentally misdialed our phone? And we ignore it and screen it. And all of a sudden, the answer machine turns on, and it's Will yelling, "We're on the porch. We got a lot of Bud Light. It's a lowbrow night. Come out and play." We lived for a time at the Cambridge Towers, which are right across the street from here. And so my wife and my kids are with us back this weekend. Got 14-year-old girl, 12-year-old girl, 4-year-old boy, and we're the only family in the U.S. Senate doing a family commute, which is terrible, but it's less bad than the alternatives, which are move to D.C. or be away from your kids all the time. So I take my kids on the road with me and love them a lot, but I got to be honest, I'm kind of happy that my 12-year-old isn't with me right now. I'm angry at her. She's figured out a new little sort of rolling trick that works everywhere. We make our kids read a lot because we're on the road a lot, and if you know Jay Nordlinger's new book, The Children of Monsters, if you don't, I recommend it. It's an extraordinary book. It looks at the families of dictators over the last 100 years. So Pol Pot, Hitler, Castro brothers. What happens to the children of dictators? Spoiler alert, it's bad. Nothing good really comes of being the child of a dictator. The best thing you can hope for is to take over the family business, and usually that means some sort of fratricide, and it turns out dictators tend to be promiscuous, so you might have 70 siblings across lots of different genital units. And my daughter, this book is called Children of Monsters, an inquiry into the families of dictators, and my 12-year-old has figured out she can sit anywhere, and as a cute little kid reading this book, people will come up and ask her, "Oh, look at that cute little kid, what are you reading?" And she tilts it up and she says, "It's my autobiography." So, I'm kind of happy she's not with me now because she's been playing this card a lot lately. So I want to do too many things, and so I'm going to talk too fast. It's a rule that I've never agreed as a public speaker to abide by. And then I know that we're going to drift mostly to question and answer, but let me give you the lightning round of 4 things I'd like to talk about, and I'll acknowledge that we'll probably only get through 2.5 or 3 of the 4, and even those not exhaustively. But first, I'd like to suggest that we are not in any way ready for the age of cyber war. I don't think it's a close question, and I'm going to say lots of things that'll lower expectations for me to claim any particular expertise at this. Many of you are professionals, practitioners, and theoreticians. I'm neither, but I'm new, and there are virtues to being new because you can ask a lot of dumb guy questions that established bureaucracies usually have a really hard time asking. So number one, I want to give a few thoughts suggesting that we're not at all ready for the age of cyber, and that an analogous way of thinking about this would be, if you want to date the beginning of the Cold War to 1945 or 1948, obviously important debates about that. If you sat in 1945 and you looked 10 years into the Cold War and you thought, what are the capabilities and needs we're going to have for 1955? What did we look like as a society planning from 1945 to 48 toward 1955, and then asked by comparison, where do we think we are now on the human capital pipeline of getting toward where we think we need to be for cyber war in 10 years? And I think we're in a much, much worse position than we would have been in the mid-1940s. Second, I'd like to talk a little bit about what that human capital pipeline for the age of cyber looks like and where we get those people. And I would suggest that we're probably not going to discover them. We're probably going to have to create that pipeline, and we're not having a lot of reflective thought about that either. And I want to tease out 3 particular traits that I think are essential for those who are going to lead and serve in our intelligence agencies and national security agencies for the age of cyber warfare. And so I want to talk a little bit about a couple of, maybe 3 attributes of what that human capital pipeline should look like. And I want to suggest that we're in a pretty troubled place as far as being sure we have a pathway to creating the kinds of human capital assets we're going to need. Third, and here is why I mostly know that I'm trying to do too much, I decided to evolve my thoughts a little bit in the last 48 hours based on what we've been seeing in Washington, D.C. in the aftermath of last Friday. So this is not about last Friday. The fact that we live in an era of more frequent jihadi attacks, probably usually small scale, sometimes medium scale, but higher frequency, I think is probably inarguable over the next decade or two. And so what happened last Friday night, not to minimize any tragedy, but one of the adjectives that we probably shouldn't put on it is surprising. But I would say that the last 48 to 72 hours have been in some very significant ways surprising. And one of the aspects of that, by the way, I am new to politics, never been a politician before, never run for anything before. David Perdue, who's a freshman senator with me from Georgia, he and I are the only 2 people in the U.S. Senate who've never run for anything before in our lives. Ironically, on our first day on the job, both of us, not knowing each other, separately introduced constitutional amendments for term limits, and then promptly got called to the principal's office. Turns out that new guys who haven't been politicians sort of affirming citizen lay governance is not taken too kindly. But I believe that some of what we've seen in the last week, and so as a new politician, even though I'm a very conservative guy, and if you look at my voting record, I'm going to be one of the more conservative senators over my 6-year term, but tonally, I'm not addicted to politics. Americans don't like people who are addicted to politics and only talk inside these partisan networks that speak to the already converted, and I find it just as boring as I think the American people do. And so even though I'm a really conservative guy, I don't talk like the only people who are interesting to talk to are those who are a part of my niche of the Republican Party. So I want to say, as sort of a little bit of an inoculant, I'm going to be implicitly critical of the president here, but I'm not critical because I'm a Republican senator and he's a Democratic president. I'm going to be critical because I think it's absolutely bizarre to not name the enemy that we face and that we're fighting, and to not do so is a failure of leadership that hurts the body politic in really significant ways. And that bridges to the fourth topic, which is a little bit about the refugee-specific issues of the last 48 hours. And I'll leave it to Will and the rest of you when we get to question and answer to see if we approximately really spend much time on the refugee point. But again, to rename the four, number one, we're not ready for the age of cyber warfare. Number two, what would the human capital pipeline look like if we were intentional about creating and shaping that pipeline? What traits do we need in those that are going to serve us? Third, why does it matter to name the enemy, and how does that bridge back to the human capital pipeline? Because I would submit that we're not going to find the right people if they don't know what cause they're embracing. If we can't invite people onto a certain team and have some clarity about what the American identity is, really hard for me to figure out why people who have lots of talent and lots of skills in life are going to risk their life and take pay cuts to work for a monopolistic institution that is the government. If there isn't a cause that compels them, we are never actually going to get great talent into that pipeline. And some of that failure of identifying our enemy leads to lots of civil discord that's not really necessary and that leadership could get us beyond. So far too much for 25 to 30 minutes, but that's my objective. So first, we're not ready for the age of cyber. We're not ready at the level of political leadership in this country. I've, again, never been a politician before, and I'm humble about what I don't know. The Admiral was generous in some of the things he said about my background. A simple way to think about the two streams of my adult work life: I'm 43, so I've had 21 adult years. Most important thing I've ever done is walk beans into tassel corn at 5 in the morning. That's how all Nebraskans find character. But as an adult, the two things I've done in my 21 years: I'm an American historian, and I've done a lot of crisis and strategy projects. I've done about 26 crisis or turnaround projects in the last 21 years. So one thing I'm decent at is coming into a broken institution and asking some fundamental questions that don't imply that I know more than the experts in that domain, but that I do know how to ask questions that help the experts in the domain flesh out what are the most mission-critical things we need to tackle. When you go into most broken organizations, I've turned around a failing 130-year-old liberal arts college in Nebraska. I live in my hometown. 130-year-old liberal arts college, to small companies, to VC-funded launch stage companies, to large Fortune 500 companies. When you go into broken organizations, one characteristic that almost all of them have is they're doing way too many things. If you have 100 utils of energy, most organizations are trying to invest 1 util in each of 100 projects. And it turns out they probably only need to be successful at 4 or at 7 things to actually be a successful organization. So rational people would put 60 utils of energy in project 1 and 25 in project 2, and then they would pause a while and decide how to reevaluate how you should spend the last 15. Do you spend them on projects 3 and 4, or do you actually double down back in project 1 and figure out what to outsource? But if you only need to do 4 to 7 things to be successful, working on priority 8 is dumb. Working on priority 88 is truly insane. And almost every organization that's going bankrupt is doing a whole bunch of things that they shouldn't be doing. And so one thing I do when I go into a new organization is I ask a lot of questions. I've been in the Senate for 11 months, and honoring an old tradition that kind of died about 35 years ago in the US Senate, I waited a year to give my maiden speech. Turns out the floor of the US Senate used to be important. It's not really very important anymore. Most of the time, there are 2 to 5 senators on the floor, and there's not a lot of actual engagement. There's a whole bunch of show theater where people pretend they're speaking to 100 other people and everyone's actually engaged. Really, they're speaking for C-SPAN cameras, and the way that video will be hacked up and sent to a really narrow, targeted portion of their own constituency. I spent a lot of my first year in the Senate interviewing almost everybody else there. Again, on a partisan spectrum, I have lots of disagreement with lots of the people that I work with. But at the level of trying to figure out, we know the Senate's dysfunctional. Why is it dysfunctional? There's a difference between knowing that a company is going bankrupt and knowing why it's going bankrupt. If you already knew why it was going bankrupt, the people there probably would have fixed it. And so a little humility in the way you ask questions is quite useful. So I spent a lot of this year asking questions, both of other senators and also of the national security and intelligence apparatus. And I'll tell you, one thing that you find behind closed doors is a lot more commonality about the problems than people are willing to acknowledge publicly, because there's usually a stereotypical, overly caricatured way that each side, and not just Republican versus Democrat, but bureaucracy X, Y, Z, A, B, C, against the others, all want to pretend that there's some Manichaean, simplistic solution to why this organization isn't working. And that's just the way people talk in public. In private, most people aren't that stupid. And so they're actually willing to have a much more deliberate conversation if they think it's off the record. And so I would suggest, from some of the interviewing I've done, it is pretty clear to almost everyone in the national security community that if you say, what keeps people up at night about the problems we're going to be facing 10 and 15 years from now that we're underinvesting in now, almost all of them would say cyber. Almost all of them would say some version of cyber. Some will cite geopolitical concerns. They'll say Putin during a lame duck period, he may feel like he has a chance to break NATO, and is there a will in the US? And democracies are always weak during a period of transition, right before an election or between the election and the inauguration of the new guy or gal. So some will say Putin, some will say fortification in the South China Sea. Some will name specific manifestations of what the jihadi threat looks like, morphed and metastasized 5 and 10 and 15 years in the future. But most people will say something about cyber. Most will also say that the executive branch outside the national security establishment isn't in anywhere prepared to deal with this. I don't actually know everybody who's present here, so I'm going to be humble and delicate so that I don't step on toes. But if you ask who was responsible before the OPM hack and during the earliest discovery of the OPM hack, it is almost impossible, even if you have, I sit on the PSI, on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of Homeland Security, and we have basically limitless subpoena power. Even if you come from PSI and you can ask hard questions, watch OPM and Homeland Security play hide the ball and blame the other guy when people aren't in the room. And then ultimately, when you write a letter that says, we're serious now, we really want an answer to this question, who's going to answer? When they don't respond to your letter and you call and you talk to them on the phone, they say, I think you should ask that question of the White House Chief of Staff. Literally, agencies are punting from agency to agency, in and out of the intel community and to the White House, and then saying the answer only could come from the president or the White House Chief of Staff because no one's in charge. What led to the OPM hack is partly a ridiculously siloed world where we have 15 plus intelligence agencies, 4 megas. The reorganization of the government that led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was supposedly going to create some kind of accountability and the creation of the DNI structure. Is there anybody who really thinks there's clarity for who's responsible for defense right now? The answer is there is not. And we could go on and on. But when you get to the human capital pipeline, one of the most obvious things we know to be true is that we don't know where we're going to get the great talent of the next generation, but we know that the national security leadership and Silicon Valley don't really know how to talk to each other at all. And it's not at all clear that there's any real trust about any solutions that might come about 6 or 12 or 18 months from now. I would submit to you that most people believe what we're really doing is waiting for the next great attack, a domestic 9/11 scale cyber attack, and then there'll be a new urgency, and then people will figure out what to do with the next round of bureaucratic reshuffling. That's no way to run a bait shop, let alone a country. So if you then say, who is going to be the human capital, what is the human capital pipeline for the intelligence leadership we're going to need for the age of cyber? There's nobody who really owns answering that question today. I would flag 3 traits that we clearly need that I think are just pretty darn basic, but this level of conversation doesn't happen in the US Congress right now. So there are 15 people in the Intel Committee in the Senate, 8 Rs and 7 Ds, and then there are a handful of us, small single digits, that are really interested in these issues and also spend a lot of time in the SCIF getting our briefings. But among those 20-ish people who are paying any attention to this, the level of our conversation is much better in private than in public because there aren't cameras everywhere, but the level of our private conversation is still really, really weak and ignorant, and I'm able to say that because I'm a new guy. almost everybody else among the 20 of us in the Senate who care about these issues and are paying some attention have a harder time admitting how ignorant and uninformed our discussion is, because once you've been there 10 and 12 and 15 years, you already have some accountability for all the needles and haystacks that weren't spotted 6 and 8 and 10 and 12 years ago. I would submit that three things that inform the three traits of the human capital that we're going to need are: one, we need much more at the broadest end of the funnel, advanced technological capabilities, fundamental skills around coding. And so then say, well, who is shaping the curriculum of West Point or of Annapolis or of Colorado Springs today? Because surely they're rebuilding their curriculum around coding. No, actually, we're still training engineers for industrial nuclear age conflict with the Soviet Union as if it's 1954. There isn't any rebuilding of the curriculum going on at any of the academies. And you could take that illustration and take it almost everywhere else through the pipeline of the military and the intel community to say coding is not something we're thinking much about. The broadest end of the pipeline in India and in China is quite different than the broadest end of the pipeline in the US. Number two, we're going to need lifelong learners. We're going to need to recruit and train and enlist in the cause people who don't think they're going to get skills once and then be prepared for the rest of their life to live off of that and maybe to get a retirement in 20 years. Life expectancy in 1935 was 62. Our shared life expectancy in this room is 81. I have a 4-year-old boy. According to CDC tables, he has a 50-50 statistical chance of seeing age 100. The careers of the kids that graduated from the college, I was college president for 5 years, left last December. The kids whose hands I shook at the podium when they got their diplomas in May and June of 2014, think about the difference between their lives and their parents' and grandparents' lives in terms of economic sustainability of their work life. In the late 1970s, average duration at a firm was still 26 years. Of kids who graduated from my college last year or a year and a half ago, according to demographers and economists and statisticians, they're not just going to change jobs, they're going to change industries 3 times before they turn 30. And this is starting at age 23. Even among people that are older than 30, average duration at a firm is currently 3.8 years. The kinds of folks we're going to need to recruit don't just need to be technologically skilled and gifted, they need to be remarkably nimble in ways that we're not preparing the broader culture for. We have what I think of now as a crisis of grade 13. We are creating the perpetual adolescence of teenage kids by implying that everybody should go to the exact same types of universities today. The reason we're doing that is not because anybody's making a conscious choice to say what's happening at most universities across the country, UT excluded, of course. I'm sure everything that happens here is marvelous. But when you go to university from ages 18 to, average time to degree at a state university right now is 5.5 years, so let's say age 18 to 24, we are not moving everybody from secondary education to higher education because we really believe this model is great. We're doing it because we don't see any jobs for 18 and 19-year-olds right now. And so over the course of the last decade and a half, over 40 of 50 states have had governors who did some version of renaming their old K-12 bureaucracy a P-16 initiative or a P-16 bureaucracy. That is saying early childhood matters a lot. Huge parts of overall student academic outcome over the course of a lifetime can be determined statistically by age 5. When they arrive at the first day of school, who knows how to read and who doesn't? The deficit of the kids who've heard thousands of different words from mom, or the kids who've heard 1 million different words from mom and dad over the course of the first 5 years of their life. So the P versus K part of the initiative makes lots and lots of sense. The 12 versus 16 I think is a much more dangerous drift. I think there is a moment in your education where you flip from being a mere consumer of things that are kind of being fed to you rote, and the reality is good parents know that of your 6-year-old and your 8-year-old and your 10-year-old, you're always trying to plant a question in their head. Even they, when they go to school, are not really being fed material by rote. You're creating a curious young being that reads as a 10 and 12 and 14 and 16-year-old with a question in mind about what's going to come in the next paragraph. And the idea that you never have a moment where you have to flip and go from being a passive recipient to the one who owns your own learning and now uses the university as a big buffet cornucopia that you draw from is a really dangerous way of thinking. And so there is a flip that I think grade 12 to freshman year in college is much too late, in my mind, for when you become a self-directed learner. Again, that doesn't mean you don't need great inputs and experts and professional sages on the stage at times, but there has to be a flip in your moment. And right now what we're doing is we're implying that grade 12 is not only too institutionalized, grade 13 and age 24 should also be pre-programmed. I think we have a societal-wide crisis at the idea that we're actually turning out adults at age 22, 23, and 24. No civilization that you can ever really look at historically has thought you can be that far beyond puberty and still not be accountable for a whole bunch of things that define adulthood. We're not doing that. In that societal problem of not having lifelong learners, the Intel community that's going to need really nimble people that keep up with an ever-accelerating pace of cyber warfare is at a huge disadvantage because of this larger societal perpetuation of adolescence. So number one, technological skills. Number two, nimble lifelong learners. And number three, and the thing that I'm going to dwell on for 7 or 8 minutes maybe, and then let Will come up and bail you out, and we'll turn to question and answer, is people have to be invited into and recruited onto a team and a cause. And if we don't know what America means, if we don't have any clarity about the American idea, then we are inevitably going to be incoherent against enemies that have a great deal of coherence. And so I'm a historian, which means I necessarily have a moral obligation to look down on sociologists. But I'm going to, for a minute, try to tease out a bit of a difference between totalitarianism and totalistic systems. That distinction matters a lot because one is about worldview and one is about societal order and power and structure and everything being monistic and unified. And this relates to the challenge we have in naming our enemy in the global jihadi fight that we have right now. I would submit to you that a huge part of why we have difficulty naming our enemy is not just because of anything that's attractive about them and our own anxieties about provoking them, though some of that is real, but it's much more about the crisis of intellectual orphanhood in America, about what it means to be an American. We are a creedal nation. This is a unique country in the history of the world. I really do not think I'm saying anything that is at the right end of the political spectrum. So we can debate the ways in American politics American exceptionalism as a term becomes contentious. But the idea that this is a unique nation is just a historical truism. At the time of the American founding, and I mean more precisely the constitutional moment, the time of the founding, not necessarily clearly at the time of the revolution, the American founders were making an argument that most of humans, throughout most of human history, had been confused about the nature of freedom and about the nature of government. There were moments in the past where this idea had seen germs before. Obviously, in ancient Greece, there were city-states in the late medieval period in Switzerland and early modern republics, sort of usually reformed, fleeing a certain kind of Lutheran Catholic fighting, again centered around Switzerland. But these are tiny places for very brief moments. They're basically cities. And by city, I don't mean Austin. They're communities of 10,000, 50,000 people. There were brief moments where you'd seen arguments like this in the past, but the American founding said something on a broad scale, 4 million people, that had never really been said before in human history. And they said that throughout most of history, people have believed that the king is free because he has a monopoly on violence. And if you have all power, might makes right. I can do what I want. What is the limit? What are the limits on me? What are the constraints on my range of action if I'm the king? I can do whatever I want. And everybody else wasn't a citizen. They were called subjects because the passive assumption was prohibition. You didn't passively assume permission. If you wanted to marry somebody, if you wanted to start a Rotary Club, if you wanted to start a small business, you needed a charter. And so you go and you supplicate before the king and his court, and you see if you were granted this charter, if you were given the right to go do that thing. But if you were not given that right, it was prohibited. And the American founders said, actually, this doesn't comport with the dignity of humans. We think that humans, we, not just us in this room, but Americans across 240 years, believe that people are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and we get these rights by nature, and government is just a tool. Government is our shared project to secure those rights. Government is not the author or source of those rights. That's the American idea. The American idea is not just about certain boundaries. The American idea is certainly not about a particular ethnicity or a particular religion. The American identity is not about a geographic footprint alone in the world. It's about a certain kind of creedal embrace. And I don't think we can recruit the kinds of intelligence leadership and foot soldiers that we're going to need for the coming generation unless we have a cause that's big enough that you take an oath to something. Because if you try to think about what's going to happen between us and China, and let's just use, again, stay on the OPM example because it's an easy illustration that we all have in common. What the Chinese now have is a database of more than 20 million records, and it was a database that was built out of SF-86s. For those of you who've never had to go through a background investigation, it is a proctology exam. Tell us about all your sexual partners. Tell us about all the mental health history in your family. Tell me about that time you and your wife had a shouting match, and even though there were no charges filed, a neighbor called the police, and they came to the door to see why you were screaming so loud. Tell me about your substance abuse history. Tell me about that DWI you got back in college. Why do they want to know all this stuff? They want to know all this stuff seemingly to protect the government from you being bribed or blackmailed by someone else having access to that information. And so we took it all, we digitized it all, and we gave it to the Chinese to create the largest spy recruiting database in human history. I'm going to say something here. I want to be very clear that this is a rumor in Washington, D.C. This is not a specific bit of intelligence that I'm telling you from any classified setting. I've never heard it in a classified setting. I want to tell you a rumor because it helps you feel the story, and whether the rumor's true or not, it's like it's like historical fiction. You get to incarnate a moment because of this. So there is allegedly a guy, married man with kids in Arlington, Virginia, who doesn't work for the intelligence community directly, but is a contractor and does a ton of work for the CIA right now. And about 2 months ago, one evening, there was a knock on his door, and there were 2 foreign agents standing on his front stoop, and they said, "Hello, John Doe, good to see you. I just wanted to tell you, that porn site that you were on last night, one of those girls that you downloaded an image of, turns out she was 17. And I just want to ask your advice. Should we start by telling your wife, your pastor, or your boss? Or would you like to help us out a little bit? Because it turns out you're working on a project where we just need one little thing. It's not a very big deal. It wouldn't do you any harm, but could you help us?" That kind of situation on speed is what a lot of cyber war is going to look like. And if you think of the historic ways of evaluating an enemy, the threat trinity, as some call it, you want to think about what your opponent's intentions are, you want to think about what their skills and capabilities are, and you want to think about what their range of motion is. What are their limitations? What is their freedom? Tell me now what you think the Chinese intentions, skills, and limitations and range of freedom are in cyber war for the next 10 years. Because if you know, your government needs your help. We don't know. We don't have an offensive doctrine, and we don't have a defensive doctrine. And the world that we're headed into, where people are going to live long, the kinds of talent we're going to need are going to have lots of opportunities. There's going to be a supply side deficit. We're not going to have enough people who can do this. They're going to be highly recruited. We're going to need to pay them a lot. Many of the people we pay a lot are not going to agree to work for one employer for their whole life. They're going to cycle in and out of some sort of relationships that we haven't yet built in the contracting apparatus for the intelligence community. And how are you going to know who a double and a triple agent is if there is not some cause that attracts them? In a world where the divide between NSA, to simplify it, and Silicon Valley is as great as it is today, the talent problem we face is even greater, because the sympathies for Snowden in Silicon Valley make almost no sense to me. But we don't have a big, broad conversation right now about what America means. And if we can't define our enemy in this jihadi moment, how will we possibly be able to define enemies and good guys and bad guys and right team and wrong team in the era of cyber, where many of these are going to be non-embodied, murky, online, placeless actors or robots? We live in a world right now where it seems to me, and I honestly invite this as genuine inquiry for questioning, teach me, give me advice on where I'm wrong, on why we would not, in this moment of jihad, be able to name our enemy as some adjective on Islamic that gets at killer or jihadi or violent. Because the three ways we sometimes limp around naming our enemy in the jihadi fight seem to me to be all very wrong in significant ways. And again, I say this humbly because I'm new, and many people in this room may write articles and name them this way, and there may be something I'm missing. But let me tell you, we mostly don't name it, and when we name it three different ways, and I think all of them have very large deficits. Number one, we talk about a war on terror. Terror is a tactic. Terror cannot have intentionality, and ultimately, you will never defeat a tactic. And the tactics may evolve. There are many ways we could talk about what we think is in the universe of terror today, and the things that may happen in warfare in the future that may not be terror, and will that mean that the battle that we currently face is over? I don't think so. I think the original naming of this as a war on terror was well motivated, as is much of the humility and apprehension about naming our opponent right now. It's because we don't want to imply that America is at war with Islam. And so we named our opponent a tactic rather than anything ideological. I think that was a bad idea. Understandable, but unhelpful. Number two, I don't think it's helpful to name a particular enemy that is defined simply by a geographic limitation. ISIS. ISIS is new. ISIS is not who we've been fighting for 14 years, and ISIS is not who we're going to be fighting in a couple of years. A couple is too precise. In a few years, I won't say two. We will defeat ISIS, and someone else will raise the black flag of death. ISIS is a specific offshoot of al-Qaeda, and there is metastasization happening around the globe right now that we are dealing with network problems, not with a defined geography. And so whether or not the borders of what territory ISIS controls, and again, I don't mean to be beating up on the president too precisely here, but it's hard to pass over the fact that Friday morning he said that ISIS was contained. Surely what he meant was the specific footprint of where ISIS is in the former Syria and Iraq had had some shrinkage. Some days that seems to be true and largely irrelevant to the actual decades-long fight we're in. And so claiming that our battle is against one particular geography, I think is also very, very unhelpful and does not steel the American people for the kind of battle that we have to face, and hopefully will sweep away lots of the politicians the next time there is actually a terror attack who haven't tried to be more forward-looking about the actual responsibilities they have to protect the next generation. Third, and closer to reasonable, but I still think unhelpful, are sociological terms that constrain Islam across a spectrum. Radical Islam, Islamic extremism. I am self-consciously a Christian. I love that I get the benefit of living in America. I do not regard the Christian kingdom and the American kingdom as the same thing in any way. But given America's history of having so many Christians in it, I think it's particularly unhelpful for America to act like we can parse inside the Islamic system what is normative Islam and what is extremist Islam. I'm a bit of a student of Islam, and I don't think I know very much, but I know a lot more than a lot of people in the US government that are talking about it. And when they define extremism, it's not clear to me why 70-year-old Methodists in the US defining what's normal in extreme Islam is going to be persuasive to anybody else. And so if you actually want to talk about what's happening inside Islam and you're not a part of that belief system, you ought to go real slow about deciding what's normative. The one thing that might be useful is some sort of demographic or ethnographic studies of who believes what. And here I think there are few better public opinion leaders, public officials on this than Tony Blair, who will talk about inside the 1.5 to 2 billion nominal Muslims in the world, some really significant minority, it's a significant minority, but it's not 10,000 or 100,000 people. It's probably tens of millions and maybe a couple 100 million inside the 1.5 to 2 billion Muslims believe in suicide bombing, believe in killing in the name of religion. To be clear, this is clearly a minority portion of Islam, but it's a big number of human beings. And for Americans to go inside Islam, pretending that this is not touching on the politically correct issues that we're always ducking when we don't want to name it, and calling it radical or extreme, rejects the point that many of the people in that tradition are theologically self-conscious about what they're doing, and it's a battle of ideas, and it's probably not for American non-Muslims to help solve that fight. So I don't think terror is useful. I don't think a geographic bounded entity like ISIS is useful as the main name of our enemy, and I don't think sociological categories are useful. What would be useful is naming the adjective that we're really mad about and willing to kill over. And that is killer Islam, or jihadi Islam, or violent Islam. That is a category, an adjectival category, that gets at the subset of Islam that we are actually in battle with. And we are in battle with it because it is a totalitarian system, Sharia law, that seeks to expand. And the American system is actually not compatible with that. Because what the American founders believed is that people have rights by nature. Government doesn't give you the rights. We, the people, give the government limited authorities because the government is just a tool by which we come together to secure our natural rights. And so America welcomes people who have totalistic worldviews. You can believe that other people are going to hell and you're a part of the elect. You can think that the elect are a really small minority or a significant minority or a majority. You have the freedom to believe that in America. You don't have the freedom to incite violence and kill other people if they don't share your theology. And so the American system distinguishes between totalistic systems that enable worldviews to be fleshed out and totalitarianism, which tries to identify your theological ideas with the powers of the state. And so the American founding said something really stunning in human history. They said, we actually are not going to name any of our rights inside the Constitution proper. Think about this debate. The founders are sitting around saying, well, wait a minute. If we don't name any rights, how do we know what freedoms the people will have? You get all the freedoms. And you, the people, decided to give the government limited and enumerated powers, and those are the only places the government can go. And so the founders were really uncomfortable with this because it was so historically unique. It was anomalous. And so they said, well, let's at least have a Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution so that people know some of the most important ones. And so they finally agreed that they would do the first 10 amendments to the Constitution as ways just to clarify the rights that we, the people, have. And they said, well, let's kind of rank order them in a significant way. All right, what should we list first? The historian in me feels like we have to appreciate the irony and the humor of this moment more. They named in the First Amendment a laundry list of things, because even when they were naming the most important thing, they couldn't name just one thing. And so they named religion and speech and press and assembly and the right of redress of grievances, which means lobbying. They named this whole laundry list of things as the first freedoms, because what they were getting at is, in America, you're free to argue, you're free to disagree, you're free to have limited worldviews, you're free to be atheistic, you're free to have a totalistic worldview, you can believe big things about heaven and hell. But what government does is it amasses power. It takes a monopoly on all violence and it says, we only use it for a very limited number of things. And that is a grand vision of the dignity of people, because it believes that we don't stand across some continuum. This is what Alexis de Tocqueville was writing about as he tried to make sense of America. There isn't a continuum, as many Europeans believed at the beginning of the 19th century, between isolated individualism where people are lonely and have no community, and government-centric total communities where the power defines what meaning is. Tocqueville comes to America and he says, I want to find the meaning of America. I want to find the center of America because all these dynamic things were happening. Europeans thought we were just religious zealots who went to the frontiers of the earth to be able to worship in goofy ways. That's what Europeans thought. And then all of a sudden, there's a canal revolution and a transportation revolution and a market revolution and all of this economic dynamism, and Europeans couldn't make sense of it. So Tocqueville comes and he decides he's going to write a travelogue. The Democracy in America, 1,500 pages, is essentially just a summary of all of his travel reports from America. And what he sends back to Europe is a stunned observation. He said, these people are economically dynamic. And it seems like it comes from their culture. And so I went to Washington, D.C., because if you're economically dynamic, you must have the greatest bureaucrats. He said, I got to Washington, D.C., and I found a swamp that is uninhabited most of the year. The people there aren't that interesting. Not much has changed since 1835. And he said, and so I went out to the colonies to find the center of America. There were 25 states at the time. He traveled to about 18 of them. And he wrote back to Europe, and he said, I've found the meaning of America. It is the Rotary Club. These people believe something amazing. You can have community by persuasion. You can enlist people as investors or as customers for your small business. You can enlist people in your social relief causes and in your educational ventures and in your scientific pursuits. You can persuade people to join your cause, not always by compulsion. And Tocqueville told a story about what America meant and needs to mean again, but we live in an age where we are orphaning the next generation, and there is so little clarity about what America means that it makes it seem to me very difficult to know who would salute and where they would sign up in the intelligence community in particular. I'll stop here by saying there are a number of reports out of France today that enlistment offices are being overwhelmed in Paris right now. It makes sense. When you suffer, and you have some clarity about who you are as a people, people want to defend that. They want to be about something bigger than themselves. But the French have a different conception of the boundaries of France than America does, and we're a lot bigger. There are asymmetric advantages to those who would use the tools of terror in a jihadi cause or in some other cause, some Putin-instigated cause or some Chinese cause of the future. There are asymmetric benefits to those who would use the tools of terror against open societies. And the only way an open society could ever be durable and combat that in the long term is by knowing why we believe in the goodness of open societies and in the dignity of people that necessitates that. We need to do that catechetical work if we're possibly going to solve our pipeline problem. Thanks.
Have a seat right here, Sam. All right. We're going to continue the conversation here. I have a couple of questions for Senator Sasse, then we'll turn it over to some of you. As you picked up, both of us are historians, and it's important, of course, for historians to deal factually, accurately with the historical record. And there was one gross misstatement I need to point out. I called you at 8 o'clock at night, and it was to offer milk and cookies. So anyway,
I have the answering machine tape, but whatever.
One other thing I should note, you picked up, we've been friends for a long time, we've had these intertwining careers, but there was a substantial deviation in our careers when now Senator Sasse left the LBJ school, left UT to go become president of a college in Nebraska and then later become U.S. Senator from Nebraska. His faculty line came open at the LBJ school, and Admiral Inman then phoned me. I was running a think tank in London at the time and said, we have a faculty line open. We need a historian. Would you be interested? Your friend Ben Sasse has recommended you. So I said, sure. So I'm now honored to still occupy your old faculty line, but my students have figured out that the previous guy in this line went on to become a president of a university and now a U.S. senator, and they keep wondering when I'm going to do anything meaningful myself. So I'm still just a president.
I think actually when Admiral Inman was recruiting him, he said, we lost an intellectual pygmy, so the bar's really low. In Bowdoin, you got a job.
All right, so anyway, to the questions. Senator, you talked about the dearth of strategic thinking on the cyber threat and the need to come up with a real doctrine there. And you, I think, appropriately drew the analogy to the early Cold War years when we were, just beginning to think about what was the use of nuclear weapons, things like this. As you'll know, of course, some of the most creative thinking on nuclear doctrine came from the academy, from think tanks. The Wohlstetters, the Tom Schellings, the Herm Kahns, who had done stints in government as well. Where now do you think we should be looking for serious conceptual thinking on cyber? Is it going to be found inside government, or is this something universities, think tanks elsewhere, or Silicon Valley? Where are we going to find this?
I'm worried. I think that think tanks are trying to fill a void in the academy right now. Obviously, this is a unique project. I'm not just doing homerism about UT because of my history here and because of my fondness for many of you. This project is rare. These kinds of projects, there were many of these in 1950 and in 1955. And we don't have many of these right now. And I think it is partly because the university is not sure whether or not it really is situated in America. And there's obviously, I won't I promise not to devolve us into the campus unrest of the last 3 weeks, but I gave the Buckley lecture at Yale 2 weeks ago, and it was in the middle of the current protests at Yale. And I'm angry about a lot of what's happening on the campuses and the attack on the First Amendment, but I'm also just really saddened because I think our students are ultimately impoverished if they don't get to grow up in a place that has a real competition of ideas. I think, a dangerous way to say it, and if there were cameras here, I wouldn't say it this way, but since there are no cameras, I think that, thank you, I was just teasing. somebody tried to bail me out by pointing out the camera. I said that we are the only family in the US Senate that's commuting. Really, I do it on purpose. My wife and I are joined in this bumpy cause because I can't be away from my kids Monday to Friday every single week. I don't want that life, and it's not good for them. But I also really don't want to raise them in Washington, D.C., because in Nebraska, the way you get your kids' character is you make them go to the fields at 5 a.m. And I know there are other ways that you all get your kids' character, but I don't know what they are. This is how I know to do it. And I think of the kinds of people I grew up with. I know I'm only 43, and now I'm going to sound like I'm 83, and I'm citing Plutarch or something. What's the matter with kids today? Why can't they be like we were, perfect in every way? But I really don't think there are kids screaming about microaggressions at the University of Missouri or at Yale who ever worked in the fields at 5 a.m. for 90 days straight, 3 summers in a row. Because if you've ever known actual suffering, the idea that you have to encounter an idea that you don't like, you couldn't call that suffering. And by the way, being challenged on the ideas that you already hold is called education. So if you never change from the things you believed before, your parents wasted a whole bunch of money. And so I worry that we're not seeing the kind of marketplace of real competitive ideas inside the universities. And so there is a very great skepticism about whether or not America's on the side of good in these fights. So I don't see much of it in the university. I think the think tanks, there is some dynamism in a lot of think tank communities right now. And so it's trying to fill in that void from the universities. But let's be honest, even the universities that are doing interesting things are kind of having to structure their funding like they're a think tank. They're not really living on the main lines of the university. And then finally, you named Silicon Valley. I think that's where the greatest divide is. You see in Silicon Valley a whole heck of a lot of talent, but a lot of it is aimless talent. I think of the GE commercial that's running on all the football games right now, where the guy is saying he just got a new job and he's a coder for GE. Somebody give me a head nod that you know this commercial. I got a job, I'm gonna be coding for GE. And his friends are just totally indifferent. They have no idea why that would be interesting. But the guy across the table trying to impress the girls has a new job as a coder, and he makes new emoticons for your smartphone that can just more rapidly send people goofy smiley faces. And they think that's awesome. Right now, a lot of Silicon Valley is pursuing the next round of VC funding for the next app that is about 18-year-old consumption. And that's really not as big a cause as what we're talking about, but we're not attracting many of those people, and it's because I don't think we have a storytelling component to the American identity.
So you mentioned earlier you resurrected the erstwhile Senate tradition of waiting until a year after your election to giving your maiden Senate floor speech. And during that year, you had a lot of private conversations with your fellow senators. A lot of them about the Senate's dysfunctions as an institution. But did any of those conversations touch on foreign policy, defense policy, national security issues? What were you hearing behind closed doors from your Senate colleagues about the kind of national security issues they're thinking about?
So I'll say one thing that's a little bit critical, and then one thing that directly answers your question with something that, while not directionally optimism inspiring, at least gives you the synthetic benefit of knowing that when people agree on something in common, there's catharsis to that, right? You at least can analyze a problem effectively. I guess the first thing to say is, out of 100 of us, it's a small number who are really, really obsessed about these issues and worried. And that in itself worries me, because I think we have a pipeline problem in politics. I think we have the wrong kinds of people running. I didn't run because I was obsessed with becoming a politician. I ran, frankly, because I was really dissatisfied with the primary that was unfolding in my own state, because it didn't feel like it was going to be about big enough things. My general election ended up being relatively easy, but my primary election is where, in a conservative red state like Nebraska, was going to be won. There were 5 of us in my primary. 4 of us raised a lot, 5 good candidates. 4 of us raised a lot of money. One was the wealthiest guy seeking federal office in America last cycle, and another one was a war hero with 85% name ID. I started with 3% name ID in a poll that had a margin of error of plus or minus 5. So statistically, my mom was really upset. There was a decent chance I didn't exist. It was somewhere between -2 and 8% of the public knew I existed. But I wanted to join the race because I wanted to talk about bigger things than just the sort of rote Republican and Democratic talking points. And again, I'm a conservative guy, but I think most of politics in Washington are about too small of things. And I think a lot of the people who run in an environment where a lot of people don't have a lot of other options, and they do this because it's a fine gamble to take in the face of a lot of attack ads that can destroy your reputation, but are probably going to be won and lost based on a couple of 30-second TV ads. And it doesn't create a filter for finding the right kind of legislative leadership and talent to be aligned with the biggest 3 or 4 or 5 generational crises that we face, and we've got big ones besides this. Entitlement budgets are completely fake, and the disrupted nature of work that we're headed into over the next decade will lead to the exacerbation of income inequality, regardless of any government policy solutions to this, because the nature of work is going to have some small number of huge beneficiaries in an intellectual and IT kind of context. So first of all, I guess I would say it was disappointing how few people are, even in private, obsessed with the national security challenges we face. One thing that was a little more encouraging is there was widespread agreement among the Senate. I interviewed, a big chunk of the Senate in conversations over the last 11 months, and people agree that partisanship drops radically when we're dealing with national security issues in private, which means in the SCIF, because there are no cameras. And so right now, everywhere you go to do work in the Senate acts like it is a short-term campaign. We stand up in the Russell Rotunda and we do 30-second or 2-minute or 3-minute hits on Fox or MSNBC or CNN, and of course that's going to look like a campaign with just reductionistic sound bites. But unfortunately, the floor of the Senate's the same thing, and the committee structure is the same thing, because there are cameras everywhere. It's not helpful, and most people get that. And so it turns out, for national security issues, when you're in a briefing, almost the entire Senate was at a briefing Wednesday night together, and it turns out there's a lot of human collegiality and honesty, and you can argue with people that are all over the political spectrum, and you can argue with people in your own party because it's not going to be captured. And so I think there is an awareness that when the next big attack comes, there's a little bit of a foundation of humanity inside the 100-person body, but that's in the SCIF.
So one more question from me before we turn it over to any from the audience. So in the last few months, we've seen 2 strategic shocks. One is the massive Syrian refugee crisis. Well, the refugee crisis hitting Europe, largely entirely coming from Syria. And the second, of course, was the attacks in Paris last week, which has then produced the aftershock of this very intense and heated debate in the United States the last several days over the question of admitting any Syrian refugees to the United States. And so we've got, obviously, our security concerns, but then also some humanitarian traditions of refugee resettlement in our country. You're on the Homeland Security Committee. You're dealing with this a lot. How do you think about balancing those traditions in light of this very pressing policy question?
Yeah, great question. And let's just start by saying the debate we're having right now is stupidly reductionistic. Like so many debates in Washington, there's a giant excluded middle that doesn't start with actual data. I sit in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's desk in the Senate on purpose because the guy, regardless of the evolution of his political positions on certain domestic issues over the course of his career, the guy believed in data. He read sociology constantly, and he tried to bring data to bear in the debates. So let's just start with a couple of facts. 23 million citizens, or the population of Syria before the civil war started was 23 million. Most estimates right now are there are just over 10 million displaced peoples. Almost half of those are what we'd categorize as refugees, meaning they're beyond their borders. So say there are around 6 million internally displaced people and another 4 million refugees beyond the old Syrian borders right now. Think if you're the king of Jordan. There are, in many, many schools in Jordan, more Syrian students than Jordanian students right now. Most of the official estimates say something like 600,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan. If you add the people piled up right on the border, many people are estimating it's more like 1.5 or 2 million people. The level of crisis in the Middle East right now is arguably bigger than at any point since 1917. In the midst, so 250,000 people have been killed in the Syrian civil war so far. 12,000 of them are children. 9,000 people have been kidnapped and tortured before they were killed. We are having a debate right now in the United States about 10,000, and we're screaming bloody murder at each other. And 10,000, it matters to those 10,000. It makes absolutely no difference to the larger issue of 4 million external refugees from Syria right now. Right before the bombing attack, a number of Democrats were preparing to introduce legislation to raise the president's number from 10,000 to 65,000. Again, do that as a numerator on your denominator of 4 million. It doesn't even matter. And we're going to scream and divide the country over this. Here's where I think we should start with two big truths. Number one, when the first duty of every federal elected official in the United States is to protect the 320 million Americans from enemies, foreign and domestic, it is the responsibility of all public officials, and in particular the commander-in-chief, to provide comfort to the American people who are scared about foreign fighters and about those that would pretend to be terrorists and infiltrate those kind of refugee populations.
Pretend to be refugees.
Pretend to be refugees.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Pretend to be terrorists.
Oh, yeah, that's a bad
It's the
thing
real
to pretend
terrorists
to
I'm
be
worried
too.
about, not the
Thanks a lot.
pretend terrorists.
Thanks for
Anyway,
bailing me out.
Okay, all right, okay.
Why does the president not speak directly to the American people about why it's in any way in our interest to let in males between the ages of 10 and 60? Why will he not speak directly to that question? And then embrace the second tenet, which I think is relevant here and which Will spoke to. It is part of the American identity that is inscribed on the side of the Statue of Liberty. We must, to be true to ourselves, remain a people that want to be a beacon of hope to those who believe in freedom and who are struggling across the world. And it is a bad idea to constrain the president and the State Department and defense leadership when there is eventually some international summit about what to do about the Syrian refugee crisis to have preset the U.S. number at 0. I think that's a bad idea. At the same time, why are we pretending that 10,000 is going to make a difference when we're not even talking about the 4 million and the fact that the problem is currently getting worse? I don't think these two are irreconcilable. We should hold up the fact that the national security interests of America mean that the president should be concerned and should be speaking comfort to the American people who are concerned about whether or not we are going to end up with a fake Syrian refugee who's actually a jihadi who plans to blow himself up and kill a bunch of Americans. And it is also in the national security interests of the U.S. for us to lead and have a conversation with the larger international community about what is to be done about 4 million humans who are suffering. And it's more than 4 million, and it's going to get bigger. And so right now, I think the debate we're having is remarkably shallow and really, really unfortunate, and very largely the president's fault. He promised us that he was going to create a nation that was not red state and blue state, but that was trying to unite us. He could do lots
to unite us by explaining that the concerns of the American citizens and the Nebraskans who are calling my office today, who are afraid about somebody coming into the US and killing Americans, those are legitimate concerns. And for the president to say that 31 governors who've responded to the citizens of their state by mostly, some have said really stupid things, but most of them have said, let's have a pause. And he responded by saying people pretend to be tough, but they're scared of 3-year-old orphans and their moms. The widows who are the moms of 3-year-old orphans, these fake Republican tough guys. Why would he talk like that? How would that possibly unite us as a people? How is that possibly going to make us stronger in 2017 or in 2020 or in 2030 when we're still going to have these problems? We can do better than this.
Questions from the audience? All right, Emily Whalen, here. And Emily, I've already called you up, but please identify yourself and what you're doing here. Okay.
I snuck in. No, I'm just kidding. My name is Emily Whalen. I'm a second-year PhD student in the history department here. I study the history of American foreign policy in the Middle East, which is usually enough to stop a conversation. But I'm interested in your experience as an historian in public policy. There are quite a few, I think, consumers of history in our sort of political landscape, but very few people who have training as a historian. So I'm interested to hear about your experience as it, if it's sort of shaped the way that you approach issues, and if you feel that it sets you apart.
Thanks a lot. So I should be honest that I don't know that I really qualify as a strong professional historian, because unlike Will, who turned his dissertation into a great Cambridge Press book, I signed a Princeton Press contract when I was fortunate that my dissertation won some awards, and I signed a Princeton Press contract, and it was due September 1st, 2005. I think I've had 3 extensions and now not in conversation with my acquisitions editor anymore. So I became a historian not because I planned to be an academic with the vocation that you have. I became a historian because I just wanted to read a bunch more books. There was a bunch of things that I wanted to explore, and I needed a community of discourse to structure my time to be sure I would get it done, because in the mid-1990s, the rise of the internet, we were then still calling it the World Wide Web, was disintermediating sector after sector, and I was fortunate to have some strategy consulting and private equity opportunities to go and help in a lot of those restructurings as IT would blow up. Travel agency, stock brokerage, music publishing, journalism. And so I really just became an academic because I wanted to read a bunch. Along the way, though, I came to worry, and maybe this is just pivoting back to being a bit of an indictment of over-specialization in the academy and applauding you all for trying to engage practitioners in what you do here. I realized that so much of what's written in the academy is really written for dozens. And that's probably not very good writing. If you can't translate what you're doing to be beneficial to your neighbors, then probably the journal community that you're writing for isn't really interesting enough even for you to be writing for it. And so I went to history because it's a meta-discipline. History isn't really a thing in itself. History is debating where is there continuity and where is there change over time. And you could go and be intellectually promiscuous and decide you wanted to learn about math, and I could write the history of math, even though I'm not at all mathematically gifted. There'd be a way in for me to look at, some version of the history of mathematics. I try to pick something that's not in any way plausible that I'm going to do. And so history to me was a way to try to have generalization as a way to engage broader communities. And I think that it's imperative that the best and brightest, and many of those still do pursue the academy today, though I think the academy turns off so many people because of the narrow overspecialization. We have 320 million Americans, and we don't have much of a common conversation. At the time of the American founding, there were 4 million of us, and the founders didn't really believe 4 million people could have a common community. We have a federalist structure to our government for a bunch of reasons, many of them historical, that at the time of the founding, the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment was about Congress not establishing a religion, partly because 5 of the 13 colonies still had their own establishments of religion, and they were different. So federalism is partly because of the diversity of the American people, but it really is partly because they didn't think that the localist, rich, civil society mediating institutions, kind of textured life that was going to define American greatness. they didn't think you could do that without embodied connectivity. And so 4 million people was quite a lot. We've got 320 million people. We don't have a shared story, and we need more academics who can speak to the broader community. Politicians are one of the rare places where you have a calling in life that you have to be able to speak to a lot of diverse peoples.
All right, Captain Archuleta. So, sorry, the mic's upside down. Now, Dr. Archuleta, too, so please a brief introduction.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Senator, thank you for being here and for your candor and humility. We really appreciate it. I recently received a very kind letter from the Office of Personnel Management informing me that my data had been hacked, so this is especially salient for me. But I want to touch on this notion about the pipeline and cyber warfare. And so while I'm sure the Naval and Air Force academies are doing absolutely nothing about it, we at West Point, the cadets are in the audience, have actually recognized that cyber warfare is the way of the future. And so we're doing some things with the curriculum, and we're bringing in cyber specialists and computer scientists. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, has put the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. And so we're branching cadets into a cyber branch now. So we're doing a lot of things, and so we're proud of that. But my concern is, and your role in government oversight and your interest in bureaucracies and restructuring, what are you seeing with regard to cyber warfare roles, mission sets, and responsibilities? And are there any concerns that we're going to see jurisdictional overlap, parochial infighting, service infighting for dollars, for budgets, for missions? And is that a problem that as we wrestle with the way ahead?
Yes and yes. I think let's stay at OPM for a minute, and then let's look back at the last big blue ribbon panel we had on national security reform that I think issued its report in 2008. Staying at OPM for a minute, is your last name really Archuleta? It's sort of ironic. For those of you who don't know, the OPM director who took the fall after the OPM hack is named Archuleta as well. Hope your mom's doing better. Hope she has found out. This is somebody who lost her job, and so I don't have any desire to beat her up. But there's no conceivable way she was competent to oversee an agency that had that database. And they and DHS have, we've written many, many oversight letters. I have. Ron Johnson, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee and Governmental Affairs Committee, has jurisdiction in this area, and chairman's written a bunch of letters. We've written some letters together. We've helped press figure out how to ask questions. It's just pushing a beach ball under a swimming pool in your backyard, and it pops up somewhere else. And right now, I think it's a widely known but dirty little secret that, Department of Homeland Security is not held in high regard by the rest of the intelligence community. And yet lots and lots of statutes seem to imply they're the hub of planning for defense in this regard. And it isn't just infighting and disrespect and budget fighting. It's the reality that there's not many people at CIA or at DIA or at NSA that are really ever going to defer to DHS on any issue. And so we ended up with Homeland Security for political reasons, not for rational, long-term strategic and structural reasons. President Bush was opposed to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security before he needed to be for it politically heading into the 2004 elections. So Lieberman and Collins were chairman and ranker of the Government Reform Committee at that point. And once it was clear that there was a desire to reorganize the intelligence community boxes and it was going to come out of the Congress, the Bush administration pivoted from being against to being for a creation of Homeland. But we never really resolved any of those tensions. And so we are at a legacy now, 14 years. Think about this, just to go back to being history students as a community for a minute. The Cold War lasted 41 to 44 years, depending on how you want to count. We're now 26 years since the fall of the wall in Berlin. We're 24 years since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. We're 17, 18 years since we identified al-Qaeda as a really significant risk. We're 14 years since 9/11. We're 11 years since the creation of Homeland, 10, 11-ish. We all know that this structure doesn't work. and that we really need to rebuild the intelligence community and its relationship, not just to the Pentagon, but its relationship to the committee structure and the Congress, so there can be actual oversight. We're not doing any of that right now. And so and I think people mostly just think we're waiting for the next attack. And so I want to quote for you. The last time we had a blue ribbon panel on this called the Project on National Security Reform, one long paragraph here. Here's their conclusion in 2008. We're 7 years past this, and I don't think you can find anybody in the leadership of the national security community or the intel community particularly who would disagree with this yet today, yet we haven't done anything about it. The legacy structures and processes of a national security system that is now more than 60 years old no longer help American leaders to formulate coherent national strategy. They do not enable them to integrate America's hard and soft power to achieve policy goals. They prevent them from matching resources to objectives and from planning rationally and effectively for future contingencies. As presently constituted, these structures and processes lack even the means to detect and remedy their own deficiencies. The hacking of the OPM database should be a sign to us that census databases are at risk. Databases A, and B, and C, and D. What changes has the executive branch made in the last year and a half to safeguard us against the next OPM-style attack? Almost nothing significant. Somehow we got to say something positive before we leave.
Okay, Professor Chesney gets the last question. And whether you answer it or not, you can say something positive.
Could it be about Husker football against Michigan State? Because I can be really happy about all
I have
this.
an offensive coordinator recommendation for us. That might be useful. So your comments about naming the enemy got me to thinking, and from a law professor's perspective, it got me to thinking about the authorization for use of military force. It's been 14 years. Congress did authorize force in 2001 in an indirect way specifying al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban. It's 14 years down the road. The nature of the enemy has evolved in extraordinary ways. Should Congress step up and authorize force afresh? And if so, against whom should it specify the authorization?
Great question. So I've tried not to be a politician today. I've tried to be blunt, but I'm going to probably duck a tiny little bit on this. But let me start with the first half because I think that's clearer. The second half is obviously a lot more complicated. Short story is yes, I think we should authorize force. I think we should go further. I think we should declare war again. We haven't done this since the 40s. We should get to beyond euphemisms that are Washington-centric and that are instead citizen engaging. The citizens are the people who fund these battles, and the citizens are the ones who go and die. And so I think we should not only authorize force, we should declare war. How we constrain that, what enemy, what geographic limits, with what budgeting, and whether and if there are time constraints on it, I think are really important debates we should have. And so I'll try to sound a note of bipartisanship here as we conclude. I think that Tim Kaine has pushed really hard for a bigger and more serious, more adult conversation about this than a lot of people in Washington, and so I'm grateful for the man who I hope isn't the next vice president of the United States. But it was a joke that I have Tim Kaine in my pool for who Hillary Clinton selects as a running mate. I think that it's really difficult to talk about this in a simple way when you have all the dysfunction of the Washington appropriations process at the same time. So I think rational people could differ on time limiting the authorization. How long are you able, Chief Executive, Commander-in-Chief, to wage this war for? And there are good debates, there are good arguments to be made on both sides of that debate, but all of that presupposes that the power of the purse exists and is real. And we don't have that. We have a Washington that exists on autopilot, that screams bloody murder at each other every 6 to 18 months about bumping up against the debt ceiling, now at $19 trillion, while ignoring the fact that our entitlement obligations are all kept off book on Enron-style accounting, and they're almost 3 times more significant than everything in the publicly held bond debt number. And so what really exists is that we still teach our 4th graders and our 8th graders in civics class that America is the Army, and we also have some social safety net programs that date to the 1930s and to the rise of the Social Security system and the New Deal. In reality, the budget of the US government is a giant insurance company that just also happens to own a Navy on the side. That's what the US government actually is. If you do forensic accounting, the US government is HHS, Health and Human Services, and we're headed toward a world in the next decade, little over the next decade, where 5 entitlement programs will be more than 2/3 of the whole budget. Think about that in historical context. When JFK was president, we spent 52% of all federal dollars on national security. We spent 1% on health entitlements. Early 1960s, 52% national security, 1% health entitlements. Today, we're headed toward a world over the next decade where Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, Social Security, and interest on the debt. Again, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, 3 health programs, Social Security and interest on the debt are 71% of federal spending, and the remaining 29% is basically half and half, national security and non. And so we're spending 14% of federal spending on defense and national security. And we have the sequestration type debates where Washington doesn't ever actually do real budgeting. It's just on autopilot. So we passed a law in 1974 that created the modern budget process. It roughly worked from 74 to 78. And in the 37 years since 1978, 37 years, that's basically my whole life. In the 37 years since 1978, how many times do you think there's been a budget process in Washington? 2. In 1989 and in 1997, there were budgets. There was an appropriations process, more particularly. 35 of the last 37 years, more than 2/3 of all spending from Washington has been done in an omnibus late at night right before Thanksgiving or Christmas break. So every year around September 20th to 25th, Washington is stunned to find that an annual appropriations process needs to be done annually. There's holy crap, we're out of money in 5 days. You know what we should do? We should have this fake debate between 0% and 102%. Let's either shut down the government or let's fund everything we did last year plus 2% with no accountability. No rational person thinks either of those make any sense. Nobody's for shutting down the government. And nobody, even those who want lots more government spending, think that every dollar we spent last year was well spent. We should do it all again plus 2%. And so we get to September 30th, and the New York Times will praise us because we were adults, because we passed a continuing resolution to keep doing the same thing with no actual scrutiny of what we spent money on last year. And we'll do a continuing resolution for 6 to 10 weeks. And then right before Thanksgiving or Christmas, on autopilot, we'll do an omnibus, which is a whole bunch of stuff that none of the legislators have read and the American people don't understand, but it breeds lots of cynicism. And so in that world where government is on autopilot and the power of the purse doesn't really exist, the executive has more and more power in that world. And the legislature, the first branch of government, has less and less power. And let's be clear, this is as much the legislature's fault as it is the executive's fault that we've gotten to a world where we've moved legislative and policymaking powers from the legislature inside the executive branch. But in that world, even though in general I'd be for authorizations that are about defeating and killing and destroying a specific bad guy and winning a war, and therefore, why would you time limit it? How would you not also have a conversation about time limiting it if money is going to flow through that spigot forevermore with no accountability for the people who actually have to go and stand for election before the American people, because they actually own this country, and they should be able to fire all of us who serve them. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Senator.